The autumn wind blew through the trees at Riverside Park. Jane pushed her daughter Amy on the swing. Jane's dark hands moved gently as Amy, with her light skin and blonde curls, laughed with joy. "Higher, Mummy, higher," Amy called out. Jane smiled, thinking about the special day 3 years ago when she and her husband Tom had welcomed their adopted daughter into their family. On a bench nearby, Helen watched with a worried look. She had been coming to this park for many years and thought she knew all the regular families. Something seemed strange to her. The woman pushing the little fair-skinned girl didn't look like her mother, at least not by birth. Helen's mind filled with stories she had seen on the news about missing children. When Jane pulled Amy from the swing and the child started to cry about wanting more time, Helen felt she needed to do something. With shaking hands, she called the police, thinking she was doing the right thing. "I need to report something concerning at Riverside Park," she said quietly into her phone. "There's a woman with a child who doesn't appear to be hers." As Helen waited for the police, she watched Jane comfort Amy. The little girl stopped crying quickly and hugged Jane tightly. Helen noticed how Amy looked up at Jane with complete trust. For a moment, Helen wondered if she had made a mistake. Jane reached into her bag and pulled out a small snack for Amy. They sat together on a bench, sharing apple slices and talking quietly. Amy laughed at something Jane said and snuggled closer to her. Their bond looked real and loving. Other children came to ask if Amy could play. Jane nodded and watched carefully as Amy ran off to join them. She kept her eyes on her daughter the whole time, just like any caring mother would. Helen felt the first hint of doubt. Maybe she had jumped to conclusions too quickly. But then she remembered all those missing children reports, and she convinced herself that being cautious was better than ignoring a possible problem. 20 minutes later, 2 police officers walked into the park. Helen stood up quickly and waved them over. "I'm the one who called," she said. "That woman there with the blonde child." The officers thanked Helen and walked toward Jane, who was now helping Amy put on her jacket as the afternoon grew cooler. Helen stayed close enough to hear what was happening. "Excuse me, ma'am," one officer said. "Could we have a word with you?" Jane looked up, surprised. "Yes, of course. Is something wrong?" "We received a call about a possible concern regarding this child," the officer explained carefully. "Would you mind showing us some identification and explaining your relationship?" Jane's face showed a mix of understanding and sadness, as if this wasn't the first time this had happened. "Amy is my daughter. My husband Tom and I adopted her when she was 6 months old." The officer nodded. "Do you have any documentation or photos you could show us?" "Of course," Jane said calmly, though Helen could see her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her phone. Jane showed them family photos and pulled up adoption papers on a legal app. Amy looked confused. "Mummy, why are these people talking to you? Did I do something wrong?" "No, sweetheart," Jane said, stroking Amy's hair. "These officers are just doing their job. Everything is fine." One of the children's mothers from the playground walked over. "Is everything okay, Jane? Amy and Lily have dance class together. They've been friends for ages." The officers exchanged glances. "Thank you for your cooperation, ma'am," one said to Jane. "Sorry for the interruption to your day." As they walked away, Helen felt her face grow hot with shame. She had been so certain she was doing the right thing, but now she could see she had made a terrible mistake. She had seen a black woman with a white child and immediately jumped to the worst conclusion. The officers stopped to speak with Helen. "The situation is resolved," one told her. "That's her adopted daughter. Everything is in order." Helen nodded, unable to speak. As the officers left, she looked back at Jane and Amy. Jane was helping Amy put on her backpack, smiling and talking with her daughter as if nothing had happened. But Helen had seen the pain in Jane's eyes when the officers approached. Helen sat back down on her bench, watching as Jane and Amy walked hand in hand toward the park exit. She had caused this family pain because of her own assumptions. And now she didn't know how to make it right. Helen couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jane's face, the hurt in her eyes when the police questioned her about her own daughter. Helen tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts about what she had done. The next morning, Helen went about her daily tasks feeling heavy with guilt. While shopping at the local market, she stopped suddenly when she spotted Jane picking out apples with Amy at her side. "I want the green ones, Mummy," Amy said, pointing. "Those are Granny Smith apples," Jane explained patiently. "They're a bit sour." "Are you sure?" Helen watched them from behind a display of bread. Jane was just a mother shopping with her child, yet yesterday Helen had treated her like a criminal. She wanted to apologize but didn't know how. Instead, she slipped away to another aisle, avoiding them. That afternoon, Helen sat in her garden thinking about her actions. Her neighbor Bill came over to return a borrowed tool. "You look troubled," Bill said, sitting down beside her. "I made a terrible mistake yesterday," Helen admitted. "I saw a black woman with a white child at the park and called the police. It turned out she was the child's adoptive mother." Bill frowned. "That must have been upsetting for everyone." "I've always thought of myself as a good person," Helen said, her voice shaking. "But yesterday I acted out of fear and assumptions." "What does that say about me?" "It says you're human and have work to do," Bill replied. "The question is what you'll do now." After Bill left, Helen made a decision. She would return to the park tomorrow and hope to see Jane and Amy again. She would apologize properly. The next day, Helen arrived at the park early and waited. After an hour, she spotted Jane walking through the gate with Amy skipping beside her. Helen's heart raced as she gathered her courage and walked toward them. "Excuse me," Helen said softly. Jane looked up, recognition and wariness crossing her face. "I'm the person who called the police the other day, and I wanted to apologize to you." Jane stood protectively close to Amy. "I see. I made a terrible assumption based on how you and your daughter look, and I'm truly sorry," Helen continued. "There's no excuse for what I did." Amy looked up at Helen with curious eyes. "Are you a friend of Mummy's?" Before Jane could answer, Helen spoke gently. "No, I'm someone who made a mistake, and I'm trying to make it right." Jane studied Helen's face. "Thank you for apologizing. Not many people would have the courage to do that. Could I buy you both an ice cream?" Helen asked hesitantly, pointing to the small park cafe. "I understand if you'd rather not." Jane seemed to consider for a moment. "What do you think, Amy? Would you like an ice cream?" "Yes, please." Amy answered, her earlier caution forgotten. At the cafe, they sat at a small table. Amy happily ate her chocolate ice cream while the adults talked. "I've lived in this area all my life," Helen said. "Things have changed so much. When I was young, families all looked the same." "Families have always been diverse," Jane replied. "It's just more visible now. Amy is our daughter in every way that matters." "I can see that now," Helen said. "Yesterday when I saw you with her, I jumped to conclusions instead of seeing what was right in front of me, a mother and her child." Jane wiped a spot of ice cream from Amy's chin. "People stare at us all the time. Some ask questions. But having the police called, that was a first." "I'm so sorry," Helen said again. "Mummy says when people make mistakes, they should try to learn from them," Amy announced, looking up from her ice cream. Both women looked at the little girl in surprise. "Your mummy is very wise," Helen said with a smile. "I teach at the primary school," Jane explained. "I try to help children understand that making mistakes is how we grow." As they finished their ice creams, Helen felt something shift between them. The tension eased slightly. It wasn't friendship, but it was a beginning. "We come here most Wednesdays," Jane said as they prepared to leave. "Amy likes the swings." Helen understood the invitation behind the words. "I walk here often. Perhaps I'll see you again." As Helen watched Jane and Amy walk toward the playground, she felt a mix of shame and hope. She couldn't undo her mistake, but she could learn from it. She could be better tomorrow than she was yesterday. And perhaps, in time, Jane might forgive her. More importantly, Helen needed to forgive herself and commit to seeing people more clearly, not through the lens of assumptions, but as they truly were. Over the next few weeks, Helen made a point of coming to the park on Wednesdays. She would wave to Jane and Amy from a distance, not wanting to intrude but hoping to show that she was making an effort. Slowly, their brief nods became short greetings, and occasionally they would chat while Amy played. One Wednesday, Helen noticed Jane sitting alone on a bench, looking worried. Amy was not with her. "Is everything all right?" Helen asked, sitting down next to Jane. "Where's Amy today?" Jane sighed. "She's home with Tom. She has a fever. The doctor says it's just a cold, but I was up all night with her. I just came to get some fresh air during my lunch break." Helen nodded with understanding. Children's illnesses are so worrying. I remember when my son was little, I couldn't rest until he was better. "You have a son?" Jane asked, looking surprised. "Yes, David. He's grown now, lives in Scotland with his family," Helen explained. "I don't see them as often as I'd like." The two women sat quietly for a moment, watching children play. Then Jane spoke again. "I worry about Amy sometimes, about the world she's growing up in. That day when you called the police, it wasn't the first time someone questioned our relationship." Helen listened, feeling a pang of guilt. "Last year, a woman in a shop asked Amy if she was lost, right in front of me," Jane continued. Amy was confused. She said, "No, my mummy is right here." The woman looked at me like I was invisible. "I'm sorry," Helen said softly. "I was part of that problem." Jane turned to face her. "But you're trying to be part of the solution now. That matters." Just then, Jane's phone rang. It was Tom calling about Amy's fever going up. Jane quickly stood to leave. "I hope Amy feels better soon," Helen said. "Thank you," Jane replied, hurrying away. The following Wednesday, there was no sign of Jane or Amy at the park. Helen felt disappointed but understood they might still be recovering from the illness. She walked around the lake, thinking about their conversations. As she was about to leave, she noticed a community bulletin board near the park entrance. A colorful flyer caught her eye: Community Cultural Festival, this Saturday, all welcome. It mentioned food, music, and activities representing the diverse cultures of their town. When Saturday arrived, Helen felt nervous as she approached the festival in the town square. Would Jane and Amy be there? Would it be awkward if they met? The square was filled with stalls, music, and the smell of foods from around the world. Children ran about, their faces painted with colorful designs. Helen wandered through the crowd, taking in the sights and sounds. "Helen," a small voice called out. Amy was waving from a face painting stall, her cheeks decorated with butterflies. Jane stood behind her, smiling. "You're feeling better, I see," Helen said to Amy, who nodded enthusiastically. "Tom is helping run the Caribbean food stall," Jane explained. "He's quite proud of his jerk chicken. Would you like to try some?" Helen followed them through the crowd to a stall where a tall man was serving food to a long line of people. When he saw them approach, he smiled broadly. "Tom, this is Helen," Jane said simply. Helen felt a moment of panic. Had Jane told Tom about what happened at the park? Would he be angry? But Tom's smile remained warm as he extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Helen. Any friend of Jane and Amy's is welcome here. Would you like to try some food?" Helen relaxed a little. "Yes, please. It smells wonderful." As they sat at a table eating, Helen noticed how people from different backgrounds mingled easily, sharing food and conversation. It was the same town where she had lived for decades, but somehow she had never fully seen its richness before. "I help organize this festival every year," Jane explained. "It's important for children like Amy to see themselves reflected in their community. I've lived here all my life, but I've never come to this event before," Helen admitted. "There's always a first time for everything," Tom said kindly. As the evening grew later, a band began to play, and people started dancing. Amy tugged at Helen's hand. "Dance with me," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. Helen hesitated, then allowed herself to be led to the dancing area. As she awkwardly followed Amy's carefree movements, she caught Jane's eye. Jane was watching them with a smile that held no judgment, only acceptance. In that moment, Helen realized something important. The path to making amends wasn't just about saying sorry once. It was about continuing to show up, to learn, and to change. It was about seeing the world through new eyes and having the courage to join the dance. The weeks after the festival brought a gentle change in Helen's life. She and Jane began meeting for coffee after Jane finished her teaching day. These meetings started as brief, slightly awkward chats but slowly grew into meaningful conversations. Helen found herself looking forward to these times together. One rainy Tuesday, they sat in the small cafe near the school, watching droplets race down the window. "May I ask you something personal?" Helen asked, wrapping her hands around her warm mug. Jane nodded, curious. "What made you and Tom decide to adopt?" Jane smiled softly. "We tried for years to have children naturally. After several miscarriages, we realized there were other paths to building our family." She paused. "When we met Amy, it was like she had always been meant to be our daughter." Helen listened carefully. "I think that's beautiful." "Some people don't see it that way," Jane replied. "They ask questions like, 'Don't you want your own child?' as if Amy isn't really ours." Helen winced, remembering her own assumptions. "I was one of those people, wasn't I?" "You were," Jane agreed honestly. "But you're learning. That's more than many people do." On their walk home, sheltering under umbrellas, Jane mentioned that Amy's birthday was coming up. "We're having a small party at our house next Saturday. Nothing fancy, just a few friends from school. Would you like to come?" Helen was surprised by the invitation. "Are you sure?" "Amy asked if you could come," Jane explained. "She likes you." The idea that this child, whom she had caused distress, now wanted her at her birthday party moved Helen deeply. "I'd be honored." Saturday arrived, and Helen stood nervously on Jane and Tom's doorstep, clutching a wrapped present. She had spent hours choosing a book about a little girl who travels the world learning about different cultures. Tom opened the door, welcoming her with a warm smile. Their home was modest but cozy, filled with photos and colorful artwork. Helen noticed that many pictures showed Jane, Tom, and Amy, but there were also photos of an older black couple who must be Jane's parents, and a white couple who might be Amy's birth family or Tom's parents. In the living room, Amy was playing with 5 other children, a mix of backgrounds and appearances that reflected the diversity Helen had seen at the festival. They were all absorbed in a game involving toy animals and a homemade fort built from blankets. Jane emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of snacks. "Helen, I'm so glad you could make it." "Amy, look who's here." Amy ran over, giving Helen an unexpected hug. "Did you bring your special biscuits?" she asked eagerly. Helen looked confused. "Special biscuits?" Jane laughed. "She saw you sharing some biscuits with an elderly gentleman at the park last week. She was quite impressed by how much he seemed to enjoy them." "That was my neighbor, George," Helen explained. "I bring him shortbread sometimes." She felt touched that Amy had noticed this small kindness. "Next time you must bring them for us too," Amy declared before running back to her friends. As the party progressed, Helen found herself chatting with the other parents. One mother named Lily approached her. "Jane tells me you two met at the park," Lily said. Helen hesitated, wondering how much Jane had shared about their first meeting. "Yes, a few months ago." "It's nice to see Jane making new friends," Lily continued. "She's always giving to others, her students, the community, her family. She deserves people who are there for her too." Helen nodded, thinking about how much Jane had taught her in their short friendship. "She's quite special." Later, as Amy blew out her candles, Helen watched Jane and Tom standing proudly behind their daughter. The joy on their faces was unmistakable. This was a family bound by love, not by blood. After cake, when the children were playing in the garden, Helen found herself alone in the kitchen with Tom. "I want to thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For having the courage to learn and change." Jane told me everything that happened at the park that day. Helen felt her cheeks flush with shame. I made a terrible mistake. Tom nodded. Yes, you did. But what matters is what you did afterward. Many people would have walked away, too embarrassed to face their own prejudice. You came back and apologized. You showed up again and again. Your family has taught me so much, Helen admitted. That's good, Tom said with a smile. But you know what? I think you've taught us something too. You've reminded us that people can change, that it's never too late to open your mind and heart. As the party wound down and families began to leave, Amy ran up to Helen with a small piece of cake wrapped in a napkin. This is for George, she said seriously. For when you see him next. Helen carefully took the cake, touched by the child's thoughtfulness. She realized that in trying to make amends for her mistake, she had gained something precious, a window into a world more connected and caring than she had previously allowed herself to see. 6 months had passed since that day in the park when Helen had called the police. Autumn had given way to winter, and now spring flowers were beginning to bloom. Helen sat on her usual bench at Riverside Park, watching families enjoy the warm weekend sunshine. Mind if we join you? Jane asked, appearing with Amy and Tom. They carried a picnic basket and a colorful blanket. Please do, Helen smiled, moving her bag to make room. As Tom spread the blanket on the grass nearby, Amy carefully placed her favorite stuffed rabbit in the center. Mr. Flopsy gets the best spot, she explained seriously. Helen watched as this family that had once been strangers to her set up their picnic. How different things were now. What had begun with a terrible mistake had somehow grown into a precious friendship. We have news, Jane said as she handed Helen a sandwich. I've been asked to speak at a community meeting next month about diverse families in our town. That's wonderful, Helen replied. You'll be perfect for that. Actually, Jane continued, glancing at Tom, we were hoping you might join me. Helen nearly choked on her sandwich. Me? But why? To share your perspective, Tom explained. About how communities can learn and grow. About how people can change. Helen shook her head. I don't think I'm the right person. I made such a terrible judgment that day. That's exactly why you are the right person, Jane said gently. Most people won't admit their mistakes, let alone try to make things right. Your story might help others reflect on their own assumptions. Amy, who had been listening while feeding bits of apple to Mr. Flopsy, looked up. You should do it, Helen. My teacher says brave people talk about hard things. Helen felt tears prick her eyes. Out of the mouths of babes, she whispered. Later that afternoon, they all walked to the duck pond. Amy ran ahead, eager to see if any ducklings had hatched yet. I've been thinking about that day, Helen admitted as they walked. About how close I came to never knowing your family. All because I couldn't see past appearances. But that's not the end of the story, Jane reminded her. Look at us now. At the pond, Amy squealed with delight at the sight of tiny yellow ducklings following their mother across the water. Look, Mummy. Look, Helen. They're a family just like us. Everyone laughed at the child's innocent comparison. Helen watched as Tom lifted Amy onto his shoulders for a better view, her small hands resting comfortably on his head. You know, Helen said thoughtfully, I might take you up on that speaking offer after all. A month later, Helen stood nervously in the community center, waiting her turn to speak. The room was full of people from all parts of town. Jane had already given her presentation about adoption in diverse families, showing beautiful pictures of different family structures that existed in their community. When it was Helen's turn, she approached the microphone slowly. Her hands trembled as she unfolded her notes. 6 months ago, I saw a black woman with a white child at the park, she began, her voice shaking slightly. Instead of seeing a mother and daughter, I saw a reason for suspicion. I called the police. The room grew very quiet. That woman is here today, Helen continued, gesturing toward Jane. She had every right to be angry with me, to never speak to me again. Instead, she showed me grace I didn't deserve and gave me the chance to learn and grow. As Helen continued her story, she saw people in the audience nodding, some wiping away tears. When she finished, the applause was warm and genuine. After the meeting, several people approached Helen to share similar experiences, times they had made judgments based on appearances, times they had been judged unfairly themselves. One elderly man squeezed her hand. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong," he said. "Thank you for your honesty." On the way home, Jane, Tom, Helen, and Amy stopped for ice cream to celebrate the successful event. "Helen," Amy asked as they sat at a small table, ice cream dripping down their cones, "are you coming to my school next week? Mummy says it's family day and we can bring people who are important to us." Helen looked at Jane and Tom in surprise. Jane smiled and nodded. "Family isn't just about who looks like you or who shares your blood," Tom explained. "It's about who shows up, who cares, who learns and grows with you." As Amy cheerfully counted all the people she considered family, her parents, grandparents, cousins, and now Helen felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. The mistake that could have kept them apart had become the very thing that brought them together. In trying to make amends, Helen had found not just forgiveness but also friendship, and something that felt very much like family.